Racist police officers force Shaquille O'Neal to do push-ups in freezing weather. The next day, the digital clock on Shaquille O'Neal's dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as he navigated the snow-covered streets of Baltimore. As a respected city councilman, he had just emerged from an exhausting budget meeting where heated discussions about departmental funding had stretched far longer than anticipated. The gentle snowfall outside his car window created an almost hypnotic pattern, and the sub-zero temperatures had cleared the streets of all but the most determined travelers. Shaquille's mind wandered to the warm meal his wife had promised to keep waiting for him. Their daily ritual of sharing late dinners had become even more precious since his appointment to the city council. These moments of connection helped ground him amid the increasing pressures of public service. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him from his thoughts. Instinctively, Shaquille checked his speedometer. He was exactly at the speed limit. Confusion crossed his face, but years of his father's sage advice echoed in his mind. His father, a former officer himself, had always emphasized the importance of remaining calm during any encounter with law enforcement. Following protocol, Shaquille carefully signaled and pulled over beneath a streetlight, its harsh glow cutting through the thickening snowfall. His hands settled at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him. The winter wind whistled through a small gap in his window, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Two officers approached his vehicle, their demeanor immediately setting off warning bells in Shaquille's mind. Their body cameras were conspicuously dark, and their approach carried an inexplicable hostility that made his heart race. Despite his position as a city councilman, despite his years of community service, despite everything he had accomplished, Shaquille found himself facing a situation that would challenge not only his dignity, but the very foundations of justice in his beloved city. The officer's commands came sharp and fast, ordering him out of his vehicle. The bitter cold hit Shaquille like a physical blow as he stepped out, his jacket providing little protection against the intensifying snowfall. Their tone carried something beyond mere authority. It held contempt, prejudice, and a desire to demonstrate power over another human being. What happened next would forever be etched in Shaquille's memory. The officers, their badges gleaming under the streetlight, ordered him to perform push-ups in the gathering snow. The absurdity of the command was overshadowed by its clear intent to humiliate. Shaquille, a man who had spent that very evening deliberating over millions in city funding, found himself facing a choice: stand up to this abuse of power and risk escalation, or comply and live to fight another day. Drawing upon reserves of dignity and restraint he didn't know he possessed, Shaquille lowered himself to the frozen ground. Each push-up was accompanied by derogatory comments from the officers, their words carrying the weight of generations of prejudice. The snow soaked through his clothes, but the cold was nothing compared to the burning shame and anger building inside him. As he performed this degrading exercise, his council member identification badge slipped from his pocket, landing in the snow with a soft pat. The revelation of his identity caused a momentary pause in the officer's behavior, but by then the damage was done. Unknown to all involved, several passers-by had recorded the incident on their phones, their hands shaking with anger as they documented this abuse of power. Shaquille O'Neal, the respected councilman who had dedicated his life to public service, who had worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between communities, who had always believed in the power of dialogue and understanding, found himself face down in the snow, his dignity under assault. But even in this moment of humiliation, his mind was already turning toward how this experience could catalyze change. The videos of the incident would soon spread across social media like wildfire, igniting a conversation that the city had been avoiding for far too long. But for now, Shaquille remained in the snow, each push-up a testament to his resilience, each moment an indictment of a system that needed profound reform. The night air carried the weight of impending change, though none of the participants yet realized just how significant this encounter would prove to be. As snowflakes continued to fall around them, creating an almost surreal backdrop to this scene of injustice, Shaquille held on to one thought: this moment would not be in vain. He would transform this experience into something powerful, something that would shake the very foundations of the system that allowed such abuse to occur. The question was not if, but how this transformation would take place. The following morning, the city of Baltimore awoke to a social media storm. The videos of Councilman Shaquille O'Neal's humiliation had spread rapidly overnight, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views and igniting a firestorm of public outrage. The footage, shot from multiple angles by concerned citizens, painted a clear picture of abuse of power that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. In his kitchen, Shaquille stood silently, watching the videos circulating on social media. The breakfast his wife had prepared sat untouched as he observed his own dignity being stripped away in the harsh glare of streetlights and prejudice. His usual morning routine disrupted, he found himself staring into his cooling coffee, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. His wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They need to be held accountable," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This isn't just about you, Shaquille. This is about every person who has ever faced this kind of treatment, but didn't have the platform to fight back." Shaquille nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "This is bigger than accountability for two officers. This is our chance to push for real, systematic change." He reached for his phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn with messages from fellow council members, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Within hours, Shaquille had called for an emergency session of the city council. The chamber was packed to capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallways and outside the building. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern-day totems, broadcasting this moment of reckoning to the world. As Shaquille took his place at the podium, the room fell into a hushed silence. The evidence he presented was overwhelming. Traffic camera footage, witness statements, and most damningly, the viral videos that showed the full extent of the officer's misconduct. But it was his personal testimony that held the chamber spellbound. "Last night, I experienced something that no human being should ever have to endure," Shaquille began, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath his words. "But I stand before you today not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a catalyst for change. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem that we can no longer afford to ignore." The council session stretched into the afternoon as Shaquille laid out a comprehensive plan for reform. His proposals included mandatory sensitivity training, increased community oversight, and a complete overhaul of the department's accountability measures. Each point was met with growing support from his fellow council members, who recognized that the political winds had shifted dramatically overnight. But it wasn't just the political establishment that was being moved to action. Outside the chamber, a grassroots movement was already taking shape. Community leaders were organizing peaceful demonstrations, social media campaigns were gaining momentum, and citizens from all walks of life were finding their voices, inspired by Shaquille's courage to speak out. As the session progressed, Shaquille introduced perhaps his most ambitious proposal: the creation of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate and recommend action in cases of misconduct. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about creating a new paradigm of community police relations based on mutual respect and understanding. "We have a choice," Shaquille declared, his voice rising with passion. "We can allow this incident to become another statistic, another forgotten headline, or we can use it as a catalyst to build the kind of city we all deserve to live in. A city where dignity is not determined by position or power, but is recognized as the inherent right of every human being." The chamber erupted in applause, but Shaquille wasn't finished. He turned to address the cameras directly, knowing his words would reach far beyond the council chambers. "To every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, I say this: your voice matters, your experience matters, and together we can transform our pain into progress." As Shaquille concluded his speech, the atmosphere in the chamber was electric with possibility. Even those who had initially been skeptical of such sweeping reforms found themselves moved by the moral clarity of his vision. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation was rapidly evolving into something far more significant, a turning point in the city's history. The following weeks saw Baltimore transformed into a crucible of reform. Shaquille O'Neal's ordeal had sparked a movement that transcended the original incident, touching on deep-seated issues that had long simmered beneath the city's surface. The viral video had become more than just documentation of a single act of misconduct. It had become a rallying cry for systematic change. In his office at City Hall, Shaquille sat surrounded by stacks of proposals, policy documents, and letters of support from across the country. His computer screen displayed a constant stream of email notifications, each one representing another voice, joining the chorus for change. The incident that had left him face down in the snow had evolved into something far bigger than himself. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Board was taking shape, carefully structured to have real power and influence. Shaquille had insisted on a diverse membership that reflected the city's population, including community leaders, legal experts, and former law enforcement officials known for their integrity. The board would have the authority to review complaints, recommend disciplinary actions, and propose policy changes. "This is exactly what we've been working toward," said Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a respected civil rights attorney who had agreed to chair the board. She sat across from Shaquille, reviewing the final draft of the board's charter. "But we need to ensure these changes are permanent, not just reactive measures that will fade with time." Shaquille nodded, remembering the burning sensation of snow against his palms during those humiliating push-ups. "We're not just changing policies," he replied, his voice firm. "We're changing the culture. That's why the training programs are just as important as the oversight." The new training initiatives were comprehensive, focusing not just on cultural sensitivity, but on the fundamental relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officers would spend time working with community organizations, participating in neighborhood events, and engaging in dialogue sessions with residents. The goal was to break down the barriers of mistrust and build genuine understanding. Outside Shaquille's office, the movement continued to grow. Community organizations that had previously operated independently were now working together, coordinating their efforts and amplifying their impact. Local businesses had joined the cause, offering their resources and platforms to support the reform efforts. Even some veteran officers had stepped forward, sharing their own stories of witnessing misconduct and expressing their desire for change. One afternoon, as Shaquille walked through his neighborhood, he encountered Officer James Chen, a 20-year veteran of the force who had become an unexpected ally in the reform movement. "I don't know," Chen said, falling into step beside him. "What happened to you that night? It's making a lot of us really think about the kind of department we want to be part of." The conversation with Chen highlighted another aspect of the changes taking place: the emergence of internal advocates within the department itself. Officers who had long stayed silent about misconduct were finding their voices, encouraged by the broader movement for reform. They were becoming active participants in reshaping their department's culture. The media coverage had evolved as well. What had started as sensational headlines about a councilman's humiliation had developed into thoughtful analyses of systemic issues and potential solutions. Journalists were diving deep into the history of police-community relations, examining successful reform efforts in other cities, and highlighting the voices of those who had long advocated for change. In community centers across Baltimore, discussion groups formed spontaneously, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their experiences and ideas for reform. Shaquille made a point of attending these meetings whenever possible, not as a councilman, but as a listener and participant. Each story he heard reinforced his commitment to ensuring that his experience would lead to lasting change. One evening, at a particularly powerful community meeting, an elderly woman stood up to speak. Her voice trembled with emotion as she recounted decades of witnessing similar incidents in her neighborhood. "But this time," she said, looking directly at Shaquille, "this time feels different. This time we're not just talking about change, we're making it happen." The woman's words captured the sentiment that was spreading throughout the city. The reforms weren't just bureaucratic changes or policy adjustments, they represented a fundamental shift in how the community viewed itself and its relationship with law enforcement. The incident that had humiliated Shaquille was becoming a catalyst for a broader transformation. As the third week of reforms drew to a close, Shaquille stood at his office window, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of orange and purple. The same streets that had witnessed his humiliation were now witnessing a renaissance of civic engagement and social change. The push-ups he had been forced to perform in the snow had become a symbol of resilience and transformation, their meaning completely transformed by the movement they had inspired. As the reform movement gained momentum, Shaquille O'Neal found himself grappling with the personal implications of his experience. The public knew him as the face of change, the catalyst for reform, but in private moments he still felt the weight of that snowy night pressing down on him. It was during a quiet evening at home as he sat in his study, reviewing the latest proposals for police reform, that the full emotional impact finally caught up with him. His wife entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea, her presence a steady comfort in the storm of changes that had engulfed their lives. She noticed how he had been staring at the same page for the past hour, his mind clearly elsewhere. "You're thinking about that night again, aren't you?" she asked, setting the cups down on his desk. Shaquille looked up, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and vulnerability that few ever saw. "I keep wondering how many others went through similar experiences but didn't have the platform to speak out," he admitted. "Every time I think I've processed it, another layer reveals itself." The revelation of his inner struggle coincided with a new phase in the reform movement. While the institutional changes were progressing steadily, Shaquille recognized the need to address the human element of the transformation. He began organizing support groups for individuals who had experienced similar encounters, creating safe spaces where people could share their stories and begin their own healing journeys. During one of these sessions, held in the community center where he had started his political career, a young man shared a story that struck a particularly deep chord. "When I saw the video of what happened to you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "it was the first time I felt like someone would finally understand what I've been through. It was the first time I felt like maybe things could actually change." These personal connections reminded Shaquille that real change required more than just policy reforms and oversight boards. It required healing the emotional wounds that had been inflicted on individuals and communities over generations. The support groups became an integral part of the reform movement, addressing not just the systemic issues, but the human cost of prejudice and abuse of power. In his professional life, Shaquille found himself approaching his counsel duties with a new perspective. Every budget discussion, every policy debate, now carried the weight of his personal experience. He became a more effective advocate for change, able to speak not just from political conviction, but from lived experience. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging council session about funding for community programs, Shaquille shared a moment of unexpected connection with Councilwoman Maria Rodriguez, who had initially been skeptical of his reform proposals. "How you know?" she said during a break. "Watching how you've handled this whole situation, turning something so personal into something so constructive, it's changed how I think about these issues." The comment reminded Shaquille of something his father had told him years ago. Sometimes the most powerful change comes not from winning arguments, but from sharing our humanity. This wisdom had taken on new meaning in the wake of his experience, as he watched personal stories transform political opponents into allies in the fight for reform. As the weeks passed, Shaquille began to notice subtle changes in himself. The anger that had initially fueled his drive for reform was evolving into something more sustainable, a deep commitment to lasting change that went beyond his personal experience. He found himself becoming more patient in discussions with those who disagreed with him, more willing to listen to different perspectives, even as he remained firm in his commitment to reform. During a private moment of reflection in his office, Shaquille pulled out the council member badge that had fallen into the snow that fateful night. The badge, now a symbol of both his humiliation and his redemption, reminded him of how far he had come and how far there was still to go. He had learned that true leadership meant being willing to share not just your strengths but also your vulnerabilities. The personal transformation Shaquille was experiencing paralleled the changes taking place in the city. Just as he was learning to integrate his experience into a stronger, more compassionate version of himself, Baltimore was learning to acknowledge its past failures while working toward a more just future. His journey from victim to advocate to healer was becoming a template for how communities could transform pain into progress. As the sun set on another day of meetings, decisions, and small victories, Shaquille stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker to life. The same streets that had witnessed his humiliation now held the promise of transformation. He realized that true change required not just structural reforms, but personal evolution. The willingness to confront pain, share vulnerability, and believe in the possibility of transformation. 6 months after that fateful snowy night, Shaquille O'Neal stood at the podium in the Grand Hall of Baltimore's City Hall. The room was packed with citizens, officials, and media representatives, all gathered for a historic moment. The comprehensive police reform package, which had grown from his personal ordeal into a transformative movement, was about to become official policy. The changes were far-reaching and unprecedented. The Civilian Oversight Board had already begun its work, reviewing cases and implementing new accountability measures. The mandatory training programs were showing promising results, with officers reporting improved relationships with the communities they served. Body cameras were now required to be activated during all interactions with the public, and a new system of checks and balances ensured compliance. As Shaquille prepared to address the crowd, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. There was Officer Chen, who had become an instrumental voice for change within the department. Dr. Reynolds sat in the front row, her presence a reminder of the legal framework they had built together. Community leaders, activists, and citizens who had shared their stories in support groups filled the seats, their collective presence a testament to the power of unified action. 6 months ago, Shaquille began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I stood in the snow, facing a moment of profound humiliation. Today I stand before you not as someone who overcame that moment, but as someone who was transformed by it. We all were. He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. The atmosphere in the room was electric with anticipation. This wasn't just another policy announcement. It was the culmination of countless hours of work, dialogue, and collaboration between groups that had previously viewed each other with suspicion or hostility. What we're implementing today goes beyond rules and regulations, Shaquille continued. We're not just changing policies, we're changing hearts and minds. We're creating a new model of community policing that other cities are already looking to emulate. Indeed, Baltimore's reforms had caught the attention of cities across the nation. Delegations had been visiting to study their approach, particularly the innovative combination of oversight, training, and community engagement. The incident that had humiliated Shaquille was becoming a catalyst for national change. He spoke. Shaquille revealed the final piece of the reform package, a groundbreaking community engagement initiative. Police officers would now participate in regular community forums, not just as authority figures, but as neighbors and partners in maintaining public safety. The program included joint community service projects, youth mentorship opportunities, and regular dialogue sessions. But perhaps the most significant change, Shaquille said, his voice softening with emotion, is the change in how we see each other. 6 months ago, we were divided by badges and barriers of mistrust. Today, we're partners in creating a safer, more just community for everyone. The truth of his words was evident in the faces before him. Officers and community members who had once viewed each other with suspicion now sat side by side, united in their commitment to positive change. The transformation wasn't just institutional, it was deeply personal for everyone involved. As Shaquille concluded his speech, he did something unexpected. He called forward the 2 officers who had confronted him that snowy night. They had gone through the new training program, faced disciplinary action, and emerged as advocates for reform. Their journey from perpetrators of abuse to champions of change, symbolized the possibility of transformation that lay at the heart of the reform movement. "These officers," Shaquille said, gesturing to the men who now stood beside him, "remind us that change is possible when we have the courage to confront our mistakes and the wisdom to learn from them. Their transformation is as much a part of our success story as any policy we've implemented." The moment was powerful, a visual representation of reconciliation and progress that moved many in the audience to tears. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about learning from it and working together to create a better future. As the ceremony concluded and the reforms officially became law, Shaquille found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. But his mind wandered back to that cold night in the snow, when he had faced a choice between bitter resentment and transformative action. The path he had chosen had led not just to policy changes, but to a fundamental shift in how his community viewed justice, accountability, and human dignity. Later that evening, as Shaquille walked the streets of his beloved city, he noticed something different in the air. The tension that had once characterized interactions between police and citizens had been replaced by something new, a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose. Children played freely in parks where people had once hurried past in fear. Officers walked their beats not as enforcers, but as guardians of community well-being. Looking up at the stars twinkling above Baltimore's skyline, Shaquille realized that the true measure of their success wasn't in the policies they had changed, but in the relationships they had transformed. The incident that had seemed like a low point in his life had become the catalyst for a wave of positive change that would ripple out far beyond their city's borders. The story of that snowy night would be told for years to come, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a testament to the power of transforming pain into progress and the possibility of creating meaningful change through understanding, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice.